It was the sort of winter evening that seemed to hush the entire village of Little Paddocks. A thick frost had settled over the thatched roofs and cobbled lanes, glinting under the weak silver of the moon. From the windows of the quaint cottages, warm light spilled onto the snow, painting a picture of serenity and cheer. Little Paddocks, tucked away in the rolling hills of Dorset, was the kind of village where every door had a wreath, every chimney puffed a gentle smoke, and the church bells chimed in harmony with the residents' daily lives. Yet, beneath its picturesque surface, the village had secret small resentments, petty rivalries, and whispers of scandal. It was these seemingly trivial matters that Miss Jane Marple, knitting by her fire in Street Mary Mead, found endlessly fascinating. Though she was often underestimated by those who considered her merely a sweet, elderly lady with an interest in gardening, Miss Marple had a keen eye for human behavior. She knew that the calmest villages often held the deepest currents beneath. This particular December, Miss Marple had received an unusual invitation from her old friend, the vicar of Little Paddocks, Reverend Henry Cuthbert. He wrote in his neat, spidery script, "Dear Miss Marple, the parish is hosting its annual Christmas Eve fete at Waverley Manor, and it would delight me greatly if you could join us. I fear, however, that this year there are tensions afoot. Nothing dreadful, I hope, but certain disagreements among the guests have me uneasy. Your presence would be reassuring. Yours sincerely, Henry Cuthbert." Intrigued, Miss Marple packed her favourite grey coat, a small velvet reticule, and a collection of hand-knitted scarves before boarding the late afternoon train. The journey was as picturesque as the village itself, fields glimmering with frost, smoke curling from distant chimneys, and crows flitting in the pale sunlight. As the train approached the Little Paddocks station, Miss Marple's sharp eyes caught the sight of Waverley Manor in the distance, a grand, yet somewhat austere Georgian house, with ivy climbing its walls and wreaths adorning the windows. Upon arrival, she was greeted by a flurry of activity. Servants bustled with trays of mince pies and mulled wine, while the manor's hall sparkled with holly, tinsel, and candlelight. Guests, dressed in their finery, mingled in animated conversation. Among them were several familiar faces to Miss Marple. Lady Edith Waverley, the manor's formidable matriarch, renowned for her perfectionism and sharp tongue. Mr. Gerald Hargrove, a suave businessman with a penchant for discreet gambling. Miss Lucy Thorne, Lady Edith's timid niece, whose gentle manner masked a surprisingly strong-willed personality. Dr. Robert Langley, the local physician, pragmatic and calm, yet with a hint of aloofness that often made villagers uneasy. Mrs. Winifred Bellamy, the vicar's sister, known for her gossip and dramatic flair. Mr. Thomas Ashdown, the manor's steward, efficient and loyal, but quietly resentful of the family's whims. Miss Marple observed them with quiet interest, noting the subtle tensions in body language and tone. Lady Edith was already clashing with Mr. Hargrove over some trivial matter concerning the placement of decorations. Miss Thorne appeared restless, glancing at her watch repeatedly, and Mrs. Bellamy, true to form, was quietly eavesdropping on every conversation, a faint smile playing on her lips. The evening proceeded with cheerful anticipation carol singing, a rousing game of charades, and the occasional witty remark from the vicar. Yet, as the clock neared 10, an uneasy hush fell over the assembled guests. A sudden cry echoed from the top of the grand staircase. Rushing to the scene, Miss Marple and the others found Lady Edith Waverley collapsed at the foot of the stairs, pale and motionless. The vicar checked for signs of life, and, with a frown, declared that Lady Edith had passed away. The cause was immediately unclear. There were no signs of a struggle, no visible injuries beyond a slight contusion on the head, likely from a fall. Yet Miss Marple, standing quietly to one side, noted the look of restrained panic on the faces of the household staff and the subtle tension in the other guests. Something about the scene did not sit right with her. The way Lady Edith's hand clutched the banister, the faint scent of almonds in the air. Before the night ended, 2 more deaths occurred under equally puzzling circumstances. Mr. Gerald Hargrove was discovered slumped at the billiard table, his cue fallen to the floor, and in the conservatory, Dr. Robert Langley was found seated in a chair, apparently overcome by some sudden ailment. Each incident seemed accidental at first glance, yet the coincidence was too stark to ignore. 3 deaths in a single night, all within the confines of Waverley Manor. The local constabulary, led by Inspector Harold Finch, arrived swiftly. He was a competent man, yet visibly baffled by the simultaneous misfortunes. "I've seen my share of accidents," he muttered, adjusting his spectacles, "but 3 in one night. At the very least, we must consider the possibility of foul play." Miss Marple, with her usual gentle composure, offered her assistance. "Inspector," she said, "sometimes the smallest observations can unravel the greatest mysteries. May I accompany you as you examine the scene?" she said. Inspector Finch, though skeptical of an amateur sleuth, reluctantly agreed. He knew Miss Marple's reputation. Her intuition had solved more than one perplexing case in Street Mary Mead, and thus, on a cold Christmas Eve in the heart of Little Paddocks, a seemingly tranquil village was plunged into an atmosphere of suspense and unease, with Miss Jane Marple at the centre, quietly piecing together the threads of a mystery that would challenge even her formidable powers of deduction. Miss Marple began her investigation not by examining the bodies alone, but by observing the living, the guests and staff, who lingered in anxious groups, murmuring over cups of tea. She spoke first with Miss Lucy Thorne, who seemed shaken but determined to be helpful. "I was in the drawing-room reading by the fire," she explained. "I heard a thump from the staircase, and when I ran upstairs, it was too late. Lady Edith was gone." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "Did you notice anything unusual before the accident?" Lucy hesitated. "Well, Lady Edith had been particularly agitated tonight. She argued with Mr. Hargrove over the seating arrangements, and later seemed annoyed by Dr. Langley's suggestion for the Christmas dinner menu. But nothing that would... This," her voice faltered. Next, Miss Marple approached. Mrs. Winifred Bellamy, whose interest in gossip was well known. "I couldn't help overhearing that Lady Edith had received a letter just this morning," Bellamy said dramatically. "I don't know what it contained, but it seemed to disturb her greatly." Miss Marple made a mental note. Letters, she knew, could be catalysts for all manner of mischief. She then discreetly observed the scene of each death. Lady Edith's fall suggested a sudden loss of balance, yet the faint almond scent pointed unmistakably to cyanide. Mr. Hargrove's collapse appeared similarly unnatural. He had been sipping a drink moments before, and Dr. Langley's sudden ailment, though easily attributed to natural causes, now seemed suspicious in context. One by one, she interviewed the household staff, particularly Mr. Thomas Ashdown, who had access to the kitchens and wine cellar. He appeared nervous, adjusting his cuffs, and Miss Marple's trained eye noted his discomfort. "The drinks were prepared as usual," he insisted. "I had no reason to tamper with anything." Yet Miss Marple had learned long ago that motives were often hidden beneath politeness and routine. Who among the residents had no reason to wish ill upon Lady Edith, Mr. Hargrove, or Dr. Langley? Lady Edith, though stern, had a strong personality that could antagonize the more ambitious or unscrupulous. Mr. Hargrove, the gambler, may have owed debts to unsavory contacts, and Dr. Langley, despite his calm exterior, had been involved in a contentious land dispute with the Waverleys. Miss Marple also observed interactions among the guests. She noted a quiet exchange of glances between Miss Thorne and Ashdown, the subtle tension between Bellamy and Langley, and the faint irritation in Lady Edith's posthumous influence over the household. Each observation added a layer to the growing tapestry of suspicion. Her most revealing moment came when she quietly examined Lady Edith's writing desk. There, partially hidden beneath a pile of correspondence, was a note addressed to her niece. "Lucy, if anything should happen to me tonight, trust no one but your instincts." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled with insight. The message suggested premonition, but also knowledge. Lady Edith had feared for her life, and possibly recognized that one among her circle harbored deadly intentions. By the early hours of Christmas morning, Miss Marple had assembled a mental list of suspects, their possible motives, and the means at their disposal. She knew the night had not ended with the 3 deaths. It was only the beginning of a more complex unraveling of secrets, rivalries, and hidden ambitions. The first rays of Christmas morning light spilled into the frosted windows of Waverley Manor, but they brought little warmth to the troubled household. The 3 deaths of the night before had cast a pall over the festivities. Servants moved quietly, and the remaining guests gathered in uneasy clusters, each avoiding eye contact with the others. Even the vicar, normally so cheerful in his parish duties, appeared tense, running his hand through his thinning hair as he pondered the night's events. Miss Marple, however, was calm. She sat by the drawing-room fire, knitting a soft green scarf, while her sharp mind replayed every detail of the evening. Deaths, so conveniently timed, rarely occurred without design. She reflected on Lady Edith's note to Lucy Thorne, "Trust no one but your instincts." That alone suggested premeditation. The question was, by whom and why? Her first task was to re-examine the scenes of the deaths with a critical eye. The staircase where Lady Edith had fallen revealed nothing immediately suspicious. The banister was firmly in place, and the carpet showed no signs of disturbance. Yet, the faint almond scent lingering in the air was unmistakable. Cyanide, potent and nearly undetectable, could explain a sudden fatal collapse. Miss Marple made a mental note to investigate Lady Edith's drinks and refreshments more closely. In the billiard room, where Mr. Hargrove had collapsed, she scrutinized the drink in his glass. A careful swirl, and a trace of the same faintly sweet scent drifted to her nostrils. Cyanide again. The same must have been true for Dr. Langley. Miss Marple's suspicion hardened these were no accidents. Someone among the household had both access and opportunity to administer poison to multiple targets in quick succession. She began her inquiries discreetly. Her first conversation was with Mr. Thomas Ashdown, the steward. Though he had seemed nervous the night before, Miss Marple addressed him gently. "Mr. Ashdown, you had access to the drinks and meals, I understand. Is there anyone else who could have prepared them?" She phrased the question delicately, observing his reaction. Ashdown shifted uncomfortably. I don't know, Miss Marple. I prepared the punch myself, but the servants brought in drinks for the guests. Still, I would know if anything were amiss. I think." The hesitation in his voice piqued her interest, but she did not press him further, at least, not yet. Sometimes observation was more revealing than interrogation. Next, she turned to Miss Lucy Thorne, whose anxiety seemed to have deepened overnight. "Lucy, you were close to your aunt. Did she seem worried about anyone in particular?" Miss Marple asked. Lucy's hands twisted in her lap. "Worried? I I think she mentioned Mr. Hargrove once. She said he was too greedy and unscrupulous, but I never thought—" Her voice trailed off, and Miss Marple noticed a flicker of guilt, or perhaps fear, in her eyes. "Did she leave any instructions besides the note?" Miss Marple persisted. Lucy hesitated, then shook her head. "No, but she did have some small vials in her cabinet. I remember seeing them. She said they were her own remedies, nothing dangerous, I think." Miss Marple made a mental note to examine the cabinet herself. Homemade remedies could easily be misused or misrepresented. Her investigation next led her to Mrs. Winifred Bellamy, who seemed both anxious and exhilarated by the drama. "I saw Mr. Hargrove acting strangely before he fell," Bellamy whispered. "He kept whispering into his cuffed hand, and Dr. Langley. He was supposed to meet Lady Edith privately before dinner. I don't know what was said, but there was tension." Miss Marple's mind raced. There were multiple threads, secret meetings, whispered conversations, and personal animosities. The evidence suggested a complex web of motives, rather than a single impulsive act. By mid-morning, she decided to inspect Lady Edith's private cabinet. It was a small, walnut affair in her bedroom, neatly locked but not secure against a determined observer. Inside, Miss Marple found vials labelled with curious names: laudanum, tinctures, and small flasks of cyanide, the latter clearly intended for laboratory or pest control purposes. She noted the precise care with which the vials had been stored. Clearly someone had deliberate access to them, and Lady Edith herself had been aware of the potential danger. Just as she was cataloguing her thoughts, a commotion arose in the dining room. Mr. Gerald Hargrove, miraculously recovered after fainting briefly from the poison, had accused Thomas Ashdown of plotting against him. "You almost killed me!" he shouted, pointing a trembling finger. The steward protested vehemently, insisting he had done nothing. The guests, startled, erupted into murmurs. Miss Marple gently raised her hand for silence. "One moment," she said. "We must consider all possibilities. Accusations do not equal evidence." Her calm tone forced the room to quiet. She began piecing together the sequence. The guests had consumed drinks in quick succession. Lady Edith, Hargrove, and Langley had all fallen in the same time frame. The poison was accessible in the cabinet, yet she needed more clarity. Observing the interactions closely, she noticed subtle signals: Miss Thorne avoiding Hargrove's gaze, Bellamy glancing repeatedly at the vicar, and Ashdown fussing with napkins as if to cover his nerves. Something was deliberately hidden. Her breakthrough came during a casual observation in the conservatory. Miss Marple saw a tiny smudge on the rim of a teacup, barely perceptible, but enough to hold a lethal trace of cyanide. The cup had been placed by Mrs. Bellamy, who had been serving tea while chatting with Dr. Langley. Miss Marple's suspicions narrowed. She arranged to speak with Mrs. Bellamy privately. "You were serving drinks last night, weren't you?" she asked softly. Bellamy's smile faltered. "Well, yes, but that's my duty. I would never." Her voice cracked, and she fidgeted. Miss Marple watched her carefully. People often revealed more in what they did not say than in what they did. It was then that Miss Marple recalled Lady Edith's premonitory note. Whoever committed these acts had not anticipated her awareness, or perhaps had underestimated her skill in deduction. She needed confirmation, but she also knew that direct confrontation could provoke panic. A careful plan was required to draw out the culprit without endangering others. By late afternoon, another subtle clue presented itself. Miss Marple observed Dr. Langley rifling through Lady Edith's papers under the guise of arranging her personal effects. His hands lingered over the cyanide vials. When questioned, he claimed only curiosity, but the deliberate glance he gave her suggested more than mere interest. He had motive financial disputes over land and opportunity, yet something didn't quite fit. His skill as a physician meant he would know how to avoid poisoning himself. Miss Marple's sharp mind began constructing possible scenarios. There were multiple suspects, all with access, motive, and opportunity. Yet she sensed the solution lay in the smallest human habits, the idiosyncrasies that revealed true intent. In the coming hours, she would arrange a gathering to observe reactions, setting the stage for the final unmasking. By the late afternoon, Waverley Manor was thick with unease. The servants moved silently, almost anticipating the tense questions that might arise at any moment. Miss Marple, sitting quietly in the drawing-room with her knitting, allowed the room's atmosphere to speak to her. She knew that the truth often revealed itself in subtle gestures, a flicker of a glance, a shift of weight, a slightly too eager denial. Her first step was to observe the remaining guests. She noticed Miss Thorne sitting quietly near the fireplace, her hands tightly clasped, eyes darting toward the door whenever anyone approached. Hargrove, still recovering from the earlier poison, was irritable and impatient, tapping his fingers against the arm of his chair. Dr. Langley, meanwhile, seemed unusually tense, glancing repeatedly at the vicar as if seeking permission to leave. And Mrs. Bellamy, true to form, hovered around the edges, ostensibly helping with preparations for Christmas dinner, but clearly watching everyone like a hawk. Miss Marple's attention turned to small inconsistencies she had observed earlier. Lady Edith's note to her niece suggested she had anticipated danger. The cyanide traces indicated premeditation and careful planning, and yet all three deaths had occurred in different rooms at different moments, indicating that the murderer had not only planned but also coordinated the timing with remarkable precision. A sudden thought struck Miss Marple. She recalled the vials in Lady Edith's cabinet. Only someone who had knowledge of her routine and the placement of those vials could have used them. This immediately narrowed the field. Ashdown, as the steward, had access, but seemed too nervous and straightforward to commit such calculated acts. Dr. Langley had medical knowledge, but little incentive to kill Lady Edith, though Hargrove's death could serve him. Mrs. Bellamy, observant and cunning, had both the access and the opportunity, particularly during the tea service. Miss Marple decided it was time to provoke a reaction. She called a gathering in the drawing-room, ostensibly to discuss arrangements for the rest of Christmas Day. Everyone assembled, the tension palpable. Miss Marple began casually recounting events, emphasizing small details as if in conversation. "Such a curious thing," she said, "that Lady Edith was so concerned about her drinks last night. One must always be careful with unfamiliar mixtures, especially with vials kept in a private cabinet." Bellamy's hands twitched slightly, her composure faltering for the briefest moment. Miss Marple noted it silently. She continued, and how strange it was that Mr. Hargrove should feel unwell immediately after enjoying a refreshment in the billiard room. Accidents do happen, of course, but when one observes the same faint almond scent in both Lady Edith's room and in Mr. Hargrove's drink, her voice trailed off, allowing the implication to hang in the air. Bellamy's face drained of colour. I don't know what you mean," she stammered. Miss Marple's gaze sharpened. "Yes, Mrs. Bellamy, cyanide, quite clearly, and yet the source was right under our noses vials kept in Lady Edith's cabinet. A lady, cautious enough to warn her niece, but not cautious enough to prevent someone with knowledge from using them." Mrs. Bellamy's protests were growing more desperate. "It wasn't me. I only served the drinks. I don't understand." Miss Marple leaned forward slightly, her voice gentle but firm. "The truth is often revealed in the smallest gestures, Mrs. Bellamy. You have access, opportunity, and knowledge of Lady Edith's habits. You have a fondness for gossip, but this time it seems your curiosity led to something far graver. Would you care to explain why you would wish Lady Edith harm?" Bellamy sagged into her chair, her composure finally cracking. I didn't mean to kill anyone," she whispered. "I only wanted to frighten them. Lady Edith's temper, her constant criticism. I just wanted them to understand how it feels to be threatened, to feel fear." Miss Marple nodded slowly, the pieces falling into place. "Fear is a powerful motivator, Mrs. Bellamy. But fear combined with opportunity and knowledge can be deadly. You underestimated the potency of the substances you handled. One moment of misjudgment, and 3 lives were lost. Mrs. Bellamy buried, her face in her hands, sobbing." The other guests murmured in shock. Dr. Langley and Mr. Hargrove both exchanged glances of disbelief, while Miss Thorne clutched her aunt's note, her face pale but resolute. Miss Marple continued, now addressing the room. "This, dear friends, is a reminder that human nature, so familiar in small village quarrels, can sometimes manifest in the most tragic ways. Mrs. Bellamy intended a harmless scare, but her actions, combined with the deadly cyanide, resulted in 3 deaths. Lady Edith, perceptive as ever, left her niece a warning, anticipating danger from someone within her household. It is fortunate that no further harm occurred." Inspector Finch, standing silently at the back, nodded appreciatively. "Miss Marple, as always, your deductions are remarkable. I should have seen it, but your insight is unparalleled." Miss Marple smiled gently, her knitting needles clicking softly. "Sometimes, Inspector, it is only by observing the small things, the habits, the gestures, the ways people betray themselves in minor details, that the truth emerges. One does not always need the dramatics of a crime scene to reveal the culprit." With the culprit revealed, the household slowly began to regain a sense of order. Mrs. Bellamy was taken into custody with dignity, while arrangements were made for the family to grieve and recover. Miss Thorne comforted herself with the knowledge that her aunt's foresight had prevented further tragedy. Even in the aftermath, Miss Marple's keen eye continued to notice subtle details. The frost still sparkled outside, the manor's wreaths glistened in the pale sunlight, and the snow-laden hills of little paddocks remained serene. But beneath that calm surface, the lessons of human nature, of jealousy, fear, and misjudged intentions, lingered reminders that the quietest villages sometimes held the deepest secrets. Christmas morning at Waverley Manor dawned clear and cold, with the sun glinting on the frost that had settled overnight. Though the sky was bright and the world seeming at peace, the atmosphere inside the manor remained tense. The previous night's tragedies, the deaths of Lady Edith Waverley, Mr. Hargrove, and Dr. Langley were fresh wounds, and the revelation of Mrs. Bellamy as the inadvertent culprit had left the household both relieved and unsettled. Miss Marple, as usual, observed quietly. She had spent the early hours reviewing her notes, considering the small behaviors, gestures, and conversations that had guided her deduction. She reflected that human nature, even when disguised by charm or propriety, rarely escaped detection when one knew where to look. The first order of business was practical, ensuring that the victims were properly cared for and the household could proceed with dignity. Reverend Cuthbert had summoned the parish doctor, arranged for funeral preparations, and quietly informed the village constabulary of the events. Miss Marple assisted where she could, her calm presence offering comfort to Miss Lucy Thorne and other relatives. Miss Thorne though still shaken, approached Miss Marple privately. "I don't know how to thank you, Miss Marple," she said softly. "If you hadn't understood, if you hadn't seen through it all." Her voice trembled. Miss Marple smiled gently. "It is not thanks I require, my dear. Lady Edith herself left you a warning, and it is the small attentions, the observations, and a little patience that help us understand human nature. Sometimes the quietest mind is the sharpest." The household slowly began to regain a semblance of routine. Servants busied themselves with decorating for the late Christmas luncheon, and even the dining room, which had been the scene of Mr. Hargrove's collapse, was restored with care and ceremony. The village, too, sent messages of sympathy, though gossip naturally spread quickly. Miss Marple paid little attention to it. She knew that curiosity and conjecture were far less reliable than evidence and observation. One matter remained: Mrs. Bellamy. She had been taken into custody, but her explanation that she had only intended to frighten, not kill, was noted. The authorities, aware of her remorse and the unintentional nature of her actions, decided on a course of rehabilitation rather than harsh punishment. Miss Marple, ever compassionate, ensured that the vicar would oversee her care and spiritual guidance. As the afternoon sun warmed the frost-laden windows, Miss Marple finally took a moment to relax by the drawing-room fire. She sipped her tea, observing the gentle bustle of the manor staff, the quiet conversations between family members, and the small, comforting rituals of tea and cake. Even in tragedy, life found a way to continue. Her thoughts turned to the lessons of the evening. The first was, naturally, the power of foresight. Lady Edith's intuition had saved her niece from further danger. The second was the importance of careful observation. Small gestures, minute habits, and slight discrepancies often revealed far more than dramatic confessions or overt evidence. And the third was the complexity of human emotion. Jealousy, fear, and ambition, when combined with opportunity, could lead to unintended catastrophe. Miss Marple's reflections were interrupted by a soft knock at the door. It was Inspector Finch, who had remained in the village to oversee the final arrangements. "Miss Marple," he said with a weary smile, "I suppose I must admit, once again, that your intuition was entirely correct. I do not know how you do it." She smiled, tapping the side of her knitting needle against her teacup. "Sometimes, Inspector, it is merely a matter of remembering what one has seen in a lifetime of quiet observation. People reveal themselves in the most ordinary ways, even when they believe themselves to be unnoticed." The inspector chuckled. "I suppose that is why you have such a reputation." Miss Marple allowed herself a small smile. "Reputation, Inspector, is a curious thing. It often precedes ability, but it is ability that matters, not reputation. And now, at last, the village may begin to heal." By late afternoon, Waverley Manor had returned, in small part, to its festive appearance. The Christmas trees sparkled in the hall, holly adorned the mantelpieces, and the smell of roasting turkey drifted through the corridors. The surviving guests moved quietly, some offering condolences, others merely resuming small talk, but all aware of the night's events and their consequences. Miss Marple, knitting calmly by the fire, reflected once more on the evening's discoveries. 3 lives had been lost, but justice tempered by understanding had prevailed. She thought of Lady Edith, whose foresight had averted further tragedy, of Miss Thorne, who would inherit not only a home but a lesson in vigilance, and of Mrs. Bellamy, whose remorse would guide her toward better understanding of her own impulses. As twilight descended over Little Paddocks, the village returned to its quiet charm. The snow glistened, the church Bells rang a gentle chime, and the warmth of hearths spread through cottages and manor alike. Miss Marple, her knitting now complete, rose and placed it neatly aside. It was a Christmas unlike any other, a reminder that even in the most serene villages, human nature could create its own storms. Yet, with patience, observation, and a careful mind, those storms could be weathered and calm restored. And so, with a final glance at the snow-dusted hills, Miss Jane Marple settled back into her chair, content in the knowledge that the village was safe once more, and that the delicate balance of human behavior had once again revealed the truth in its subtle, unassuming ways.